All right, everybody, welcome to your first of two review walking classroom sessions. This first one is going to talk about Chapter 8, which was the physiology of obesity, and the Know Your Core 4. The second one will cover Chapter 18, which is looking at self-reliance, and then we'll talk about legal issues. So you're going to have two. And so this first one that you should be on right now is regarding Chapter 8 and Know Your Core 4. So at this point, I want you to make a determination of where you would like to go and complete your walking or your physical activity as you listen to these walking classrooms. I most certainly, as long as the fitness lab is available, I will have the fitness lab open for you. If the stairs are available, the bleachers out, and there's nothing going on, you most certainly can use that area. If you would like to go outside, please feel free to do so. You can also use the concourse to be able to walk around. But whatever you're using, whether it's the fitness lab or outdoors, whatever you're using, I want you to be doing some form of physical activity as we go through these particular reviews, okay? So you should already be on your way to your destination of where you want to do your physical activity, and I'm going to go ahead and start with some review. And so starting this particular section of notes that will be on the final exam, the very first chapter that we started talking about was Chapter 8 in your textbook, which is the physiology of obesity. And some of the information was a quick little review at the start of our presentation, and then we went into a program that I developed and that we will use in the Wellness Lab called Know Your Core 4. Okay, so one of the first things that we talked about when it comes to obesity, what I called re-education, is really what is the difference between overweight and obesity. And I want you to think about it from a standpoint of how would you explain this to a client, because I can assure you that most of the clients that you were going to be dealing with, whether it's health coaching, whether it's worksite wellness, whether it's personal training, most individuals are going to associate everything with a number on the scale, okay? And we know that a person who is overweight has usually experienced an increase in body fat, but not always, as in obviously the case of individuals that are very muscular. So you have to be able to understand and know what truly is the difference between being overweight and being obese. And of course, overweight basically looks at height is proportionate to weight or vice versa. Okay, so what does your height say that you should actually weigh? And so when we look at obesity, that's really looking at body fat percentage. It doesn't take into account your weight. It doesn't take into account your height. It takes into account what is the percentage or the makeup or the composition, which is where we get body composition from. What is the makeup there? And so we know that there are problems associated with people just simply using a scale or people using a BMI or a height weight chart. We know that those are some of the issues dealing with that. So it's really important to try to get individuals that you work with to focus more on what is body fat percentage, because if they are carrying a large percentage of lean tissue, as most people know, musculature, then the scales are going to tell them that they're overweight and they're unhealthy, and that may not necessarily be accurate. So we use BMI and overweight are sort of good measures for large populations, but they're not good on an individual scale, if you will. Then we sort of talked a little bit about determining body fatness using BMI. And BMI is obviously calculated. You have to put your weight in kilograms and divide that by your height in meters squared. So that's the formula there. Most of the time, people can just simply type in BMI calculator and come up. And so it's not really one that I particularly have you individuals know how to work the formula, because it is so handy on an app or a Google. But you need to understand that BMI is one of the forms that is used to be able to simply come up with more of a general health status for individuals. It's very less invasive than skin fold or a DEXA, but again, it's not necessarily a good measurement of overall body fatness when it comes to determining whether or not someone is healthy. But overweight, a BMI, anything greater than 25. Okay, so a BMI greater than 25 is going to put somebody in the overweight category. Obese is obviously going to be anything that is equal to or greater than 30 for obesity. Okay, and this is all based on BMI. This is not based on an ACSM or an ACE body fat percentage scale. These are just simply numbers. And then, of course, morbidly or extreme obese is going to be anything that's greater than or equal to 40. Okay, so if you're looking at your numbers there, 25 overweight, obese 30, morbidly obese is going to be 40 or greater. Okay, and so again, BMI is weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared. And so then we sort of looked at BMI in the clinical setting. Again, we talked about the fact that BMI, what are the problems with BMI, that it does not measure body fat. However, it does quickly sort of give us an approximation of an individual's degree of sort of health. BMI provides useful information about a client's potential health risk. So again, it can give us a little bit of information there. Provides a platform again for which really to be able to start that discussion about the relationship between an increased body fat percentage and chronic disease. And so that's essentially what we sort of use BMI for in the clinical setting. And we know it has some limitations. Obviously, healthy adults can actually be misdiagnosed by BMI as either overweight or obese because it doesn't take into account muscle tissue. And so we want to make sure we're very particular. And again, I can just encourage you that if you're going to do things on an individual basis, then don't use a measurement that's typically used for groups. Okay, that's a good way to think about it. Don't use a measurement that's typically used for groups like BMI to do an individual measurement. Okay, so do something like a skin fold or a DEXA or even a bioelectrical when you're looking at these pieces. Okay. We talked a little bit about body fat distribution. So our apples being our individuals with android obesity, so they carry predominant weight in the abdomen area. And then, of course, our individuals that have what we call gynoid obesity, which is basically they carry most of their distribution of their body fat percentage lower, so basically belly button and lower. And so weight gain in the abdomen area, so android obesity, this does increase the risk for coronary heart disease, blood pressure, diabetes, stroke. Gynoid obesity, again, weight in, as we mentioned, belly button or lower, so hips, buttocks, thighs area. And so we sort of talked about the main focus is who carries the greatest risk, okay, which is going to be your android obesity there, all right? And then we talked a little bit about the etiology of obesity. Basically, maintenance of body weight involves, physical activity. It involves your dietary habits, and it involves the metabolic utilization of those particular nutrients. So when we look at the maintenance of body weight, again, it involves three main factors. So physical activity, dietary habits, and how does your body metabolically utilize those nutrients that go in or go out, okay? And of course, we know these factors are influenced by how much goes in, so energy intake, whether or not an individual is sedentary, and of course, there's a small percentage there that genetics does play a little bit of a piece, okay? So when we looked at energy intake, so what we're taking in, there's a theory, obviously, that states that individuals become obese because they just simply consume too many calories. And we looked at two different sort of pieces. We looked at what's called active overeating, and we looked at what's called passive overeating. And active overeating is predominantly what we sort of consider our Western society. As far as a marketing of food, huge portion sizes are provided to be able to get more for less. Okay, that's a marketing ploy there. We know that this food has excessive amounts of calories related to just one single meal. Energy intake sometimes is the complete consumption of what is considered to be your daily caloric intake within one meal. So passive overeating is basically reduced energy expenditure increases a person's vulnerability to overeating. This is primarily due to the fat content of foods that provide excessive amount of calories. And then we talked a little bit about, obviously, energy expenditure. Okay, so we said that there are 3 components of human daily energy expenditure. And this was also a question on your recent quiz that we had in the classroom that you took with the groups. And so basal metabolic rate, okay, that's one component that actually expends energy. Another is the heat production when you consume food and your body's ability to break that food down. We call that thermic effect of food. And then there's heat production used through the thermic effect of physical activity. So heat production through physical activity, heat production through having to digest food, and then, of course, what is that metabolic rate and while you are obviously at rest, okay? And so of those 3, we said that about 60 to 75% of your daily energy expenditure comes from resting metabolic rate, okay? So that's why you want to make sure that your metabolism is higher when you're at rest so that you do burn more calories and you're able to intake more food if needed. But to be able to get that resting metabolic rate high, to be able to get that metabolic rate burning throughout the day as you are at rest, you have to employ physical activity throughout the day. Physical activity heat production is about 15 to 30%. And then the heat production from the digestion of food is only going to be about 10%. Okay, so that's going to basically be sort of your breakdown there. And then, of course, the last thing that we talked about when it comes to Chapter 8 is the hormonal mechanism of obesity. And we know there's several hormones that have been implicated in this whole etiology of obesity. Insulin is one of those pieces, and we'll talk a little bit about insulin when we get to Know Your Core 4 blood sugar. But leptin is one of those that we talked about. It's made by fat cells, and it does inhibit hunger, so it sort of decreases that piece. And then your short-term control of energy intake is going to be ghrelin, which is the opposite of leptin. It is the hunger hormone. And so in obesity, there is a decreased sensitivity to leptin that occurs, and this results in an inability to detect when someone is full despite having these high energy stores and high levels of leptin. Okay, so we've got two particular hormones that I want you to focus on is leptin and ghrelin. Okay. And so that was the information that we talked about specifically that we pulled from Chapter 8. And so what I'm going to go to now is the Know Your Core 4. And remember, Know Your Core 4 is a program that was created, and it's basically about knowing your numbers for the sort of what we consider the core area, the 4 core areas, which is blood pressure, blood glucose, blood cholesterol, and then, of course, body fat percentage. Okay, and so we looked at the fact that those are sort of the core 4 numbers that individuals need to keep a close eye on for their general health. Okay, and then how do you explain those numbers to clients, and then how do you assist them in determining if those numbers are healthy, and if they're unhealthy, how do you work to get them back into a healthy range, okay? And so the first thing that we started with was blood pressure. And so we talked a little bit about what actually is blood pressure. It's divided into two numbers known as systolic versus diastolic. So that systolic number is the number on top. It's basically when your heart has contracted. And then the diastolic number is when the heart is relaxed. And so I used a very clever, very artistic drawing for this particular explanation on the board, and basically the pressure that builds up in the hose pipe. So if you're outside watering the garden or washing your car and you're not using the garden hose, but you've got it turned on, so the amount of pressure, and then once you squeeze the handle and release the pressure, you've got a relaxation. So this is an example. But blood pressure is basically the pressure that is provided inside the artery walls. Okay. Again, what do we need to know about to be able to explain? Obviously, you need to be able to explain simply what blood pressure is and what's the difference between the two numbers. You know, that numbers you know, depends on the reading as far as, you know, what you need to explain to them. Sort of the consequences, what are the healthy lifestyle alternatives, and what are the different stages. So let's talk a little bit about the stages. And so one of the things I am going to recommend to you as you are studying after you've gone through this walking classroom is it's going to be really important for you to have the actual charts that are listed on the PowerPoint to be able to look at your numbers. You can, you know, it's a pretty strong, about 99.9% bet that I am going to have number information about the different four areas. So you need to make sure that you have a good knowledge of what's considered healthy and what's considered, you know, whether it's elevated, hypertension, or in a good range, moderate range, and so on and so forth. Okay, so when we look at blood pressure, obviously the different stages, you've got normal. Okay, and so basically looking at a range of less than 120 over 80 would be what you would want to look for there. And if you do have somebody who is within that range or less, obviously they're making good choices with heart healthy habits, and you want to continue to encourage them to follow whatever they're doing. If it's a balanced diet, getting regular physical activity, which is great. Okay. The next stage is going to be elevated. This is basically when we have a range of 120 to 129 over the top, and less than 80 as far as the diastolic. Okay, so this used to be considered normal. Okay, so when the new ranges come out, now we're basically looking at 120 to 129 systolic and less than 80 diastolic would be considered elevated, and that's over what I would say a consistent reading. Just because you get one particular reading doesn't always necessarily mean that someone is in, let's say, hypertensive stage 1. This has to be sort of a consistent reading that you take maybe over a 3-day period where you'll see this. Okay, so people with elevated blood pressure are likely to develop high blood pressure unless they sort of make some changes. And so this is where you want to talk to them about what does their dietary habits look like, what does their physical activity look like. Another one would probably be what does their stress look like. Okay, how do they perceive stress? How do they manage stress? What is their scale of stress on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being I'm about to have a nervous breakdown? Like, what is their stress number? Would be a good one to look at here. Do they smoke? Okay, that's another area that you would want to sort of take a little peek in to see if there's some elevations due to cigarette smoking. The next stage is going to be hypertension stage 1. Basically is when blood pressure is consistently ranging from 130 to 139 on the top, or 80 to 89 on the bottom, so diastolic, excuse me. At this stage of high blood pressure, doctors are likely to prescribe lifestyle changes and may consider adding some medication based on your risk of atherosclerosis or other forms of cardiovascular disease. Okay, and then we've got hypertension stage 2. This is consistent, ranging at around 140/90 or higher. At this stage of high blood pressure, doctors are likely to prescribe a combination of blood pressure medications along with lifestyle changes. And then, of course, our last stage is our most severe and highest risk, which is hypertensive crisis. This is when an individual needs to seek medical attention immediately. If I had a client that tested at 180/120 or higher, which is the range, then I'm probably going to ask that individual to sit very still and calm as possible. And for me, I'm probably going to phone 911. Okay, and so that's what we would consider hypertensive, life-threatening blood pressure. So 180/120 or higher. Okay, and then we talked a little bit about how to measure blood pressure, and so I gave out a different chart through American Heart Association, and I will go ahead and put that chart into the module here that basically shows some of the different components of when you were getting ready to measure a client's blood pressure. What are the things that you want to have them do? So obviously feet flat on the floor, arms relaxed at 90 degrees, legs uncrossed, put the cuff on slightly above the bend in the elbow, those different things. Okay, so if you can just know, we practice those in the classroom, but sort of what are the specific pieces to setting up a measurement for blood pressure. Okay, and then we went on to Know Your Core 4 for glucose and cholesterol. We combined those together a little bit because there is the machine that actually tests those two things. Test those together, okay, and so we combined the education of glucose and cholesterol. So the first thing we did was we did a quick little review of how the body uses glucose in as far as like when it is taken in, how does the cells actually uptake the actual glucose and use it for energy, or how it's stored. So I'm going to have you review that video as well. I may ask you one or two questions just generally about how the body uses glucose. And then we talked a little bit about the difference between type 1 versus type 2. Obviously type 1, the main function obviously there does not produce enough insulin, and type 2 is the body can't produce enough to actually keep up, and the cells become what we call insulin resistant. Okay, so the body can't keep up with enough production because there's too much sugar going into the body. And then we talked a little bit about your weight and diabetes, as far as the correlation there, many risk factors, but the single best predictor is overweight or obesity when it comes to diabetes. And we talked a little bit about fat stored in the muscle and the liver can actually cause the body to respond very sluggishly to insulin, so that's sort of a connection there. We also listed some things that make your blood sugar rise, or things that can actually make your blood sugar fall. So again, more food or carbs than usual can make it go up. Physical inactivity can make it go up. Sometimes there's side effects of medication, or not enough diabetes medication can make it rise. Sometimes infection or changes in hormone levels and even stress can also make it go up. And then just a little bit on the opposite of what can make it fall. Obviously, missing a meal or a snack can make it decline. Fewer carbs than planned can make it go down. Alcohol consumption can make it go down. Too much physical activity can obviously lessen your glucose levels as well. Okay, or too much diabetes medicine can make it go down. And then we talked a little bit about what are the signs that your blood sugar may be running too high. And I mentioned that the two main signs are frequent urination and a very strong feeling of thirst. Okay, so those are the two most common signs, but you also can feel hungry even after you've eaten. You can have extreme fatigue. You can have blurry vision. You can have cuts and bruises that are again too slow to heal. And then I provided you guys with a chart. And again, I know you can't physically see the chart because you're listening to this podcast, but I would go back and review the chart. The chart has basically normal, impaired, and then diabetic, and sort of what are those ranges when someone is fasting, after they've eating, and then about 2 or 3 hours after they're eating. So what do those ranges look like? So again, another piece when it comes to your numbers. And then we talked a little bit about what is A1C. Excuse me. A1C obviously being measures your average blood glucose level over the past 3 months, and we shared sort of what is normal, and it looks in percentages. A1C looks at based on sort of percentage ranges. So normal would be anything below 5.7. Pre-diabetic, someone with 5.7 to 6.4 would be sort of in that pre-diabetic stage. And then type 2 would be anything above 6.5 or greater there. Okay. And then we talked about obviously some main recommendations. We know that research, particularly from the National Diabetes Prevention Program, tells us that you can lower your risk for type 2 diabetes by 58% if you do 2 things. Okay, and those 2 things are going to be lose 7% of your body weight and to exercise moderately for 30 minutes a day for a minimum of 5 days a week. Okay, so the National Diabetes Program, which is conducted and put out by the CDC, says that you can lower your risk for type 2 diabetes by 58% if you do 2 things. Lose 7% of your body weight and exercise moderately 30 minutes a day for a minimum of 5 days a week. Okay? And then we went on and I showed a video about the National Diabetes Prevention Program. So I'd like for you to review that video as well. Wasn't very long. And then we went into cholesterol. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what is cholesterol. We said it's a waxy substance that is actually found in the blood, excuse me, and in the cells. It is important for cell function. It's important for hormone production. It's important for your metabolism to be efficient, and it helps to produce vitamin D, which a lot of people don't realize. Excuse me. And then we said, what are the 2 sources of cholesterol for an individual? And those 2 sources are obviously going to be that your liver produces cholesterol, and then of course you intake cholesterol via the food that you eat. And then basically breaking down the food that you eat, what are the main food sources of cholesterol? And basically we're looking at animal products, and we're looking at full fat dairy. Excuse me. I don't have any water in here in my office with me. And these foods are high in saturated and trans fats, which causes the liver to make more cholesterol than it otherwise would. All right, excuse me. I had to take a quick little break and gather myself. I started choking there, so I think I got some water. I'm good to go. Okay, so we then went in and we talked about the 3 different types of cholesterol, one being LDL, one being HDL, and one being triglycerides. And so LDL obviously is going to be least desirable. This is the one that contributes to fat buildup or plaque. This is the one where I used the example of my daughter being LDL cholesterol, which basically goes through the house and places all sorts of toys around the place and makes it very difficult for anybody to walk through the facility. So basically narrowing our options to be able to walk through the house. And I said that I was the HDL cholesterol, which sort of acted as the scavenger by coming through and sweeping that LDL cholesterol away and carrying it back to the liver for processing and removal. So that was me. I go through at the end of every night, pick up all the toys and put them back and sort of open the house back up. And that's what HDL cholesterol does. And then you got your triglycerides, which is the fat that rotates within the blood, most common type of fat in the body, and it's stored excess energy from your diet. Okay, so you need to make sure that individuals understand what is saturated, what is trans fat, and why is that's specifically bad for them when it comes to their heart health. And then when we said having your numbers checked, you basically get 4 numbers. Your total cholesterol, you get your LDL cholesterol, your HDL cholesterol, and your triglycerides. And so those are the 4 particular numbers that you want to be able to talk to a client about. And then I provided, again, a chart of what is desirable, what is borderline high, and what is high when it comes to the different numbers when it looks at total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and triglycerides. Okay, so ideally, focusing there, what is desirable might be a good area to sort of zone in on. Okay, we talked a little bit about why testing is important for clients. Obviously, it's a good awareness piece for them. It sort of helps them judge if reaching their goals, if they're intact or if they're working towards those goals, are they making progression or not. It helps them sort of understand how diet and exercise can affect their levels, and it sort of helps them to monitor the effects of any medication that they may currently be on when it comes to glucose and cholesterol. And knowing that these lifestyle changes are there, and if they can get their numbers under control, it's important to make sure they understand that they can come off of this medicine. It is possible to do that. And then I provided some resources which you will not need to know specifically for the final exam, but just know that I provided 2 specific resources when it came to cholesterol and glucose that would be good to use for future knowledge. And then, of course, the last one that we went into would be the Know Your Core 4 for body fat. And this is the section that we did not get to do face-to-face. I narrated these notes for you, so you need to make sure that you review those narrated notes if you haven't done so. So a quick review of that section. Basically, we talked, first thing we talked about is there are basically 3 different types of body fat. You have essential body fat, which is the amount of fat that your body needs to be able to carry out normal processes. Why do women get to have more body fat than men? Obviously, to be able to carry out processes like being able to give birth, menstruation, we need more energy to be able to do that, so that we pull that from fat. But essential is basically what's the bare minimum that the body needs to function. Then we have reserve. Okay, and so reserve is basically an elevation above essential, but it's still below what is excessive. Okay, so excessive body fat is basically those numbers. So we look at 25% or greater for men, 32% or greater for women. So that's too much. Your body doesn't need that much body fat to be able to function, and it starts to increase your risk of health concerns when we look at excessive. Reserve doesn't necessarily do that. Reserve is above what is essential, but it's still below excessive. And your body is not at a greater risk of being able to have chronic disease development. So it's sort of that, what we consider sort of a healthy level of body fat percentage. Okay. And so then we talked a little bit about the health risk associated with excessive body fat and type 2 diabetes. We talked about it as it relates to cancer, to stroke, to heart disease, pregnancy complications. So I want you to make sure that you can hear those narrated notes, and it may be beneficial for me to put those narrated notes in with this particular final, so that you can just pull that up and listen to those as well. And then, again, there's your chart that's going to have your numbers. So the recommendations for lowering body fat, obviously, is to make sure that individuals do not participate in any sort of starvation diet, that they understand balance energy in with energy out. They need to make sure to implement some weight training to keep lean body mass. Typically, when people try to lose a large amount of weight, they strictly focus on cardio. And yes, their number on the scale will go down, but they'll also start to lose lean muscle as well, because they don't incorporate any sort of weight training. It's just a lot of burn. That's what they incorporate. Helping them learn to read basic food labels on how to make better choices. Getting them to understand that slow and steady is the better way to win the race. They don't need to focus on spot reduction, so they can't say, I just want to lose all this fat on the back of my arm, or I want to lose all this fat here on my abdomen area, and that's not really possible. You can specifically train something to spot gain, but you cannot specifically train to spot reduce. Okay. Making sure that at the beginning of their weight loss program that they're not mistaking water loss for fat loss. That's why a body fat percentage number or a calculation is important. Don't really buy into whatever all the magical theories as far as this magic pill or this magic book or this magic diet. And don't follow fad diets. And obviously for some people, surgery can be an emergency option, but it's really should be considered a last emergency option that would be consulted with their specific physician, probably more of a bariatric physician as well. Okay, so that concludes the Know Your Core 4 and the information related to Chapter 8. Your next walk-in classroom section that you're going to click on is going to be the next one listed, which is going to cover Chapter 18 and Chapter 20.